In the old part of St. Francis, the cemetery sits on a low rise above the river, a place where wind moves like a soft broom across the grass and the stones, and where the priest's row stands in a neat line as if a lesson in order. 13 graves there are different. They have no names, no dates, no etched prayers, only small slabs sunk to the neck like tired teeth. Children are told to keep away from them. Old people lower their voices when they pass. The town clerk keeps ledgers for births and deaths going back to the first winter. But the lines for these men are blank or struck through with careful ink, a thin bar that looks almost gentle until you remember it erases a life. Visitors think the missing names are an error or a storm loss, but locals say the names were never meant to hold. They say the ground itself kept the secret because the secret wore a white collar and blessed bread and water. On some mornings the air smells faintly of tallow and smoke, like a candle put out by wet fingers, and there are circles in the grass that never take root. The sacristan claims he replaces the copper tags each season, but the tags slip or vanish, and no one wants to bend too long over those plots. The unmarked do not stand alone. They press into the mind. You can feel it on Sunday when bells ring and the sound hangs low as if waiting for a voice that does not come. Every town carries a shadow. St. Francis carries 13. They belong to the church, so no one asks the questions that would make it hard to sleep. When a priest dies, the town sings, the procession moves slow, the name is said clear. When these were buried, the wind did the singing. The ground closed fast. In the archives, there are letters from travelers who noticed the odd row and wrote polite notes back to their families about humble men and simple graves. Those letters lie. The men were not humble and the graves are not simple. They are warnings. The soil under them is packed hard in a way that speaks of weight and time and hands that wanted to be done. The caretaker once said the earth there feels colder in summer, as if something inside refuses the sun. He does not say that anymore. People in town agree on a few facts that feel like superstition but are not. A century ago, a painter tried to bring names back. He gilded the edges of each slab, wrote saints' names in steady strokes, and woke to find his paint turn black. A schoolboy made a list and left it in a church pew. It blew away when the door opened and was never found. Records go missing the way breath goes missing underwater. What kind of life must a priest live to die without identity? The answer waits patient where all quiet answers wait, in the space after a bell stops, in a smile held a moment too long, and in the year 1824 when a soft-handed stranger stepped off a coach and walked toward the church. He carried a small trunk, a travel missile, and a worn leather case that smelled of camphor. The bishop's notice called him a gift to a tired parish. Mothers liked that he blessed infants longer than needed. Men liked his laugh. Everyone liked his hands. Hands can hide things. The graves seemed to listen, waiting. Father Lucien arrived in St. Francis on a wet spring morning in 1824, stepping down from the coach with a smile that seemed to shine through the mist. He was young, not yet 40, with a soft French accent that carried both charm and authority. Mothers said he had the kind of face that calmed babies, the kind of voice that made hymns feel lighter. His hands were the detail everyone remembered. They were smooth and delicate, without the calluses of farm men or the thick veins of the older priests. When he lifted the chalice at Mass, his fingers trembled with a grace that seemed almost holy. Parishioners said it was a gift, proof that God had sent them someone gentle, someone who would bring comfort. But the gentlest hands can also do the quietest harm. Lucien was welcomed into the rectory, given the best chamber, its walls smelling of lime and candle wax. He decorated it with small tokens from France. A rosary carved from olive wood, a cloth cross embroidered with lilies. Yet at night, after the parish slept, he pulled from his trunk something else, an assortment of thick leather-bound journals tied with twine. They did not hold scripture. Their pages were ruled with ink, lined with sketches of organs and bones, instructions written in neat Latin. Detach tongue without removing breath. Reverse joints for obedience. Replace marrow with wax. The diagrams were not crude but precise, the hand of someone who had studied medicine before devotion. In the margins, he wrote not prayers but commands, cold sentences that turned the body into an instrument. He never shared these writings with another soul, and when he smiled in the pulpit break, the journals lay waiting under his bed like hidden teeth. The people saw what they wanted, a man who listened without judgment, who laid his palm on fevered brows, who blessed food with patience. Children trusted him, slipping their hands into his when their parents looked away. His laugh was gentle, but it lasted just a moment longer than it should have, and in that lingering note there was something that unsettled without naming itself. He told stories of France, of rivers and markets, but he did not tell how he left or why his order had released him. The bishop's letter was vague, praising his scholarship without detail. The parish never asked further. To them his presence was a relief, an answer to dwindling pews and weary prayers. But in the silence of his chamber, Lucien's world was different. He lined his shelves with jars, not of preserves, but of fluids that caught the light in strange colors. He experimented with wax, soaking it in oils, shaping it to mimic flesh. Each night he wrote in his journals until the ink stained his fingers, practicing strokes as steady as a surgeon's. He wrote that the body was clay and the soul was glass, and to free the soul one must reshape the clay until it yielded. He smiled when he wrote it. The parish thought his smile was kindness. They did not know it was rehearsal. By the end of that summer, no one doubted that Father Lucien belonged to them. But the earth in the cemetery seemed to know better. It had been waiting for his arrival, the way cold earth waits for the next grave. It began with something so ordinary no one thought twice. A boy of 10, quiet and pale, entered the church one late autumn evening to make his confession. His mother watched him slip through the heavy wooden doors and felt relief that her son was learning faith. Inside, the lamps burned low, and Father Lucien waited in the shadow of the confessional, his voice soft as a lullaby. The boy stepped in, kneeling in the dark box, and the door closed with a hush like a breath being held. Parishioners later swore they saw the boy's mother wait on the church steps, the minutes passing into an hour, then 2. Lucien finally emerged, smiling gently, and said the confessional would be closed for repairs. The mother left, confused but obedient, her son nowhere in sight. She told herself he must have slipped home another way. He hadn't. From that night forward, the confessional remained sealed. Lucien explained the wood had rotted, that insects had hollowed the frame, that he would oversee its restoration. He spoke so calmly no one questioned him. The parish accepted his word the way one accepts weather, with no power to resist. But rumors spread. Some said they had seen a shadow move behind the lattice after the boy entered. Others claimed to hear faint scratching inside when they walked past. Lucien's answer was always the same: silence is holy. The confessional stood mute, its door bolted, its lattice covered with linen, a shrine turned into a tomb without anyone daring to name it. Months later, repairs were ordered. Carpenters came to strip the woodworm from the confessional's side panels. When they pried back the plaster, the wall gave a sigh of dust, and then a shape appeared, pale and small, seated as if waiting to be heard. Bones bent at sharp angles. Fingers curled like claws, yet the skull leaned gently forward, its teeth pressed against the lattice slats as if whispering through them even after death. The carpenters dropped their tools and fled, but the parish council hushed the discovery. Lucien claimed it was an old burial accidentally walled in when the church was built. His smile did not break, his hands folded as if in prayer. But the records tell a different story. They show the boy's name crossed out in neat ink, a single line drawn as if erasing him from memory. The strange part was not only the bones but their arrangement. The skeleton had been bound into a seated posture, its lips fixed against the lattice, jaw wired shut with thin strands of horsehair. Whoever placed him there wanted his final gesture to mimic confession, an eternal prayer that no ear would ever absolve. Parishioners whispered that Lucien had spoken of obedience, that silence was proof of faith, and that perhaps the boy had been chosen to prove it. The mother never spoke in public again. She sat in Mass week after week, staring at the sealed box, her face pale as stone. The confessional was rebuilt, polished to a shine, and Mass resumed as if nothing had happened. But those who knelt thereafter swore the wood felt cold under their hands, as if someone on the other side still waited. Lips pressed to the screen, whispering sins that no priest would ever answer. The first name was gone, but the line of unmarked graves in the cemetery had begun to wait for more. At first it was presented as a kindness, a chance for the altar boys to learn more than their fathers had, to serve with polish and skill. Father Lucien announced it during Sunday Mass, calling it a school of silence, where boys would be taught Latin hymns, the language of heaven itself. Parents were flattered. They sent their sons eagerly, believing they were giving them a gift of learning and grace. On the first nights the boys gathered after dark, the church lit only by a few thin candles. Lucien stood before them smiling, explaining that words were clumsy, that God preferred sound without shape. He told them to hum, low and steady, as if their voices were threads weaving a single cloth. At first the boys giggled, their hums breaking into laughter, but he silenced them with a raised finger and a gentleness that felt sharper than anger. The exercises grew stranger. He placed small discs of wax on their tongues, warm from the flame, heavy enough to dull speech. He told them to keep humming, to prove that faith could carry sound even when the tongue resisted. The wax sealed their mouths with a bitter taste, dripping onto their chins, and their humming grew ragged, trembling until their throats ached. He praised the ones who endured longest, calling them closest to God. Those who failed, whose hums cracked into coughs, were told to kneel in the corner and hum against the stone until their voices broke entirely. No scripture was read, no Latin was taught, only sound without words, sound without rest. Survivors later said the nights stretched for hours, their voices stripped raw, their mouths burned by wax. Some spoke of being made to hum while standing in buckets of cold water, their legs trembling until they collapsed. Others remembered being bound at the wrists, their mouths forced open while wax was poured heavier, sealing the tongue like lead. Lucien watched with that same smile, recording notes in his small book, marking who endured, who faltered, who went silent fastest. Silence itself became a prize. He called it the purest obedience, the holiest proof of faith. And when boys went home without voices, their parents accepted it as the price of learning, never daring to challenge a priest. Then names began to vanish. The parish rolls, once neat with lists of altar boys, grew thin. A line would be drawn, or an entire entry scratched away. The ink smeared as if never written. Parents asked questions in whispers, but were told their sons had gone to serve in distant parishes, called by God to higher duties. No one pressed further. Yet in the cemetery, new plots were opened quietly, without procession, without names. The boys who survived spoke only years later, their voices trembling as if still carrying the hum. They said silence had been beaten into them not with fists but with patience, with hours of sound that swallowed breath until the body gave up. They said Lucian called silence a doorway, that through it he could shape them into something beyond themselves. What they did not say, what no one dared speak aloud, was what happened to the boys who never came home from those evenings. Their names disappeared from the rolls, their voices ended in the church, and the ground outside waited, hungry for their silence. In the spring of 1831, the town of St. Francis was unsettled by a sound that would not cease. The church bell meant to toll for mass or mourning began ringing without pause. Day and night, the clang carried across the fields, echoing over rooftops, shaking into every home until sleep itself seemed impossible. At first, parishioners thought it was an error, that the rope had been caught in wind or that some careless hand had left it swinging. But when men climbed the stairs to the steeple, they found nothing amiss. The rope hung loose, the wheel turned, and yet the sound continued. Families closed shutters against it, but even behind thick wood the vibration pushed into their bones, a ceaseless reminder that something above them demanded attention. By the second night, mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers while fathers muttered about curses. By the third, no one could endure the sound without dread. Finally, a group of workers was sent to silence it. They climbed the narrow steeple steps with tools, lanterns shaking, the air growing thick with the reek of rust and something sourer, like old blood. When they reached the beam, they saw what had bound the rope. It was not wood, not iron, but the cage of a boy's ribs. The rope had been threaded through the hollow chest, looped under bone, and knotted against the spine. His body had been lashed upright, arms pinned back against the timber, his skull leaning toward the bell as if listening. Each time the rope shifted, the remains swayed, pulling the wheel, striking the bell with a rhythm both steady and broken. The boy had become the bell ringer, his silence turned into eternal sound. The workers recoiled, some vomiting on the stairs, others fleeing into the street. When townspeople demanded answers, Father Lucien stood calm at the altar, his smile unbroken. He offered only one sentence in his neat script, written later in the parish ledger. He calls them to prayer. No explanation, no grief, just a line that sounded like an instruction. Parishioners wanted to believe it was a mistake, a desecration done by unknown hands, but whispers spread that no one had seen the boy for weeks, that his name had already been struck from the altar rolls. Some remembered him humming in the night classes, his voice breaking under wax, and wondered if this was his final lesson. The bell was cut down and silenced, the boy's remains removed, though no record states where they were laid. Some say the body was never buried, that it was hidden beneath the church floor to keep the shame from the cemetery. Others believe the bones were burned in the furnace, reduced to ash that mingled with incense. But the bell itself was never hung again. For years it sat mute, rusting in the churchyard, and townspeople swore that when storms came it groaned without touch, as if the memory of that rope still pulled it. From that spring onward, the parishioners looked at Lucian differently. His hands were still soft, his smile still sweet, but his presence carried weight, as if the endless toll of the bell had settled into him and now poured back through his eyes. Yet no one accused him. To accuse a priest was to accuse God, and the people were too afraid of silence, too afraid of truth. The cemetery waited for another stone, and the wind carried the memory of a bell that would not stop ringing. By the time 1832 came, whispers had grown heavier than prayers. People spoke of Father Lucian's past, how before his ordination he had trained under physicians in Lyon. At first, that history seemed a blessing, for he treated coughs with poultices, stitched wounds with steady hands, and calmed fevers better than most doctors. But the truth behind his knowledge emerged only at night, when the churchyard grew silent and the soil stirred again. He was seen walking the cemetery by lantern light, shovel across his shoulder as if visiting the dead long after their funerals. The ground where he walked grew uneven, patches of earth turning dark and unsettled, but the parish said nothing. They convinced themselves it was maintenance, a priest caring for his flock even in rest. Then the rumors hardened into something worse. One evening, a sexton repairing a broken fence saw a grave open, soil scattered like torn cloth. Inside lay a coffin split wide, its contents not at peace but contorted. The body was reversed, head where feet should have been, arms bent and bound, ribs stuffed with feathers, and pig organs sewn in where the human ones belonged. The sight was so unnatural the sexton swore it could not be decay but intent. When he told Lucien, the priest smiled and assured him the grave had been disturbed by animals. Yet in his journals, hidden beneath his bed, Lucien had written a single line: "The body must be humbled before the soul is freed." Over the next months, more graves were found wrong. One corpse had its eyes replaced with polished stones, lids stitched shut to hold them in place. Another had its limbs rearranged until joints faced backward, as if forced to kneel forever. Families who came to weep at graves noticed the soil shifting. The stones out of line, but they silenced themselves. To speak would mean accusing the priest who blessed their food, who touched their children's heads in prayer. Fear pressed on their throats until nothing came out but mutters. Those few who looked deeper described how Lucien's hands never shook, how he carried his instruments with reverence, laying out blades, needles, and wax as if preparing an altar. The corpses became his experiments, their flesh clay for a devotion that no one else could understand. He wrote that the soul clung too tightly to the body, that the bones resisted release, and that only through humiliation could spirit be set free. The parish did not see his journals, but they felt the change in his sermons. He spoke less of forgiveness and more of obedience, less of heaven and more of purity through suffering. By now, even those who once admired him crossed themselves in his presence. Children refused to walk past the cemetery alone. At night, families swore they heard faint scraping as if wood were being pried apart beneath the soil. Yet none dared accuse him openly. To accuse was to draw his attention, and everyone had learned what his attention meant. In the cemetery row, the nameless graves were waiting, and each new silence in town seemed to lengthen their shadow. By 1833, Father Lucien's hunger for silence had become more than ritual. It was doctrine. He spoke often of voices as clutter, of words as pollution, of sound itself as a barrier between man and God. Parishioners thought it was only philosophy, another sermon they could nod through. But in the rectory he carried the idea further. There, in the locked attic that smelled of mold and old wax, he gathered his altar boys under the pretense of training them in hymns. Parents thought their children would learn Latin canticles, but what Lucien demanded was something different, something darker. He wanted voices reshaped into tools of obedience. He called it the choir of purity. The lessons began as humming, long and steady until the boys' throats throbbed. Then he introduced nails. Each boy was told to hold one between his teeth to bite down until the iron cut their tongues. Those who flinched were struck across the face or left bound in the corner with wax dripping onto their lips. Those who obeyed were praised as chosen. The goal was not music but mutilation. He believed a voice only became holy when it bled. The attic filled with the sound of muffled cries, of metal scraping enamel, of boys choking on their own copper-tasting blood. He wrote in his journal that each drop was an offering, that each silence gained was a hymn louder than any chant. Survivors who lived to speak decades later described the next step in his ritual. Once tongues were torn, Lucien pressed them flat between wooden boards smeared with salt and ash. He left them there to dry, to harden into something that resembled parchment. He carved the boys' initials into the flesh before pressing, ensuring their voices would remain labeled, catalogued, even as their bodies weakened. When one boy begged to stop, Lucien held his face in those soft hands and whispered that silence was the truest prayer, then forced another nail into his mouth until the pleading ended in blood. Some children did not return home from these lessons. Their names vanished from the altar rolls, erased as neatly as chalk wiped from a slate. Parents were told they had gone to distant schools or been called to serve in another parish. Few dared question it, though in the quiet of their homes they felt the hollow where their sons should have been. The churchyard filled with whispers, with mothers staring too long at the attic windows, with fathers clutching rosaries until beads cracked in their hands. But still none accused the priest outright. His sermons remained calm, his hands gentle, his smile enduring. Evil wore a mask of kindness so well that people preferred their fear hidden rather than spoken. It was not until decades later, long after Lucien had gone, that workers clearing the rectory attic found the truth left behind. In a trunk bound with rusted iron straps lay a book, thick and heavy. When opened, it revealed no paper but pressed flesh. Tongues, dozens of them flattened like leaves, their edges curled with age. Each bore a carved initial, the small, brutal mark of a child once alive. In the margins of the binding were handwritten notes in Lucien's script. Silence is the only prayer that does not decay. A voice must be humbled to be holy. Investigators stood over the book in horror, yet even then the parish council urged them to keep it quiet, to avoid scandal. The choir without tongues had been silenced long ago, but the echoes of their mutilation still seemed to hang in the rafters, a hum that did not need breath. The attic remained locked after the discovery, but those who passed beneath it swore they felt the air colder, as if each nailed tongue still pressed against the void, whispering prayers no one would ever hear. And in the cemetery row, the unmarked stones grew heavier with memory, as though each one carried the silence of a voice that had been stolen. By the mid-1830s, Father Lucien was no longer a solitary figure in his rituals. Whispers spread of his discipline of obedience, a private order he claimed would restore purity to the church. He approached other priests one by one, speaking softly, offering them the vision of a faith stripped of vanity and noise. He was persuasive in a way that disarmed caution. Each man believed he alone had been chosen, that Lucien saw in him a special devotion. In truth, he was weaving them together into something darker, a circle bound not by scripture but by silence. There were 12 who agreed, drawn from neighboring parishes and missions, each convinced that obedience required more than words. They met in the rectory after dark, their gatherings hidden under the guise of prayer. At first they read psalms, but Lucien guided them toward harsher practices. He told them to fast until their vision blurred, to kneel for hours in salt, to hum until their throats bled. They obeyed, believing suffering was proof of holiness. Slowly their sermons to the flock began to change. Gone were gentle reminders of grace. Instead, they preached of silence as salvation, of the body as a cage that must be humbled. Parishioners grew uneasy, pews emptied, yet no one dared confront a ring of priests bound together. What began as doctrine soon became disappearance. The first priest was said to have traveled abroad, called to higher service. His belongings were quietly removed. His name struck through in the parish roll. Weeks later, a second vanished, and then a third, each time the same explanation written in neat ink. There were no farewells, no letters home. Just absence, and the hollow sound of a voice removed from the pulpit. Lucien continued smiling, assuring the faithful that their brothers had gone on to greater duties. But the townspeople noticed something that the ledgers did not. In the cemetery, new graves appeared side by side, each unmarked, No procession, no blessing, no names carved into stone. The ground shifted as if under weight, the soil tamped flat before dawn. People walking by saw earth darker than the rest, the grass refusing to grow. They counted and whispered, 1, 2, then 3, until there were 12. 12 priests who had followed Lucian into his discipline, and 12 who were buried in silence beside him. Some said they had seen lantern light in the cemetery at night, figures moving with shovels, shadows bent low. Others claimed that muffled chanting drifted from the rectory long after midnight, broken by sudden quiet. Fear settled heavier than faith. Families avoided the churchyard. Farmers crossed themselves at the sound of the bell, though it rang no more. Yet no one demanded answers. To accuse one priest was dangerous enough. To accuse 13 was unthinkable. By the time the last grave was filled, the parishioners had stopped pretending. They knew the men had not gone abroad. They knew higher service was a lie written in ink to soothe shame. The unmarked stones stood in a row, 13 now, a line of silence carved into earth, and though no one spoke of it aloud, everyone felt the weight of their presence, the sense that obedience once promised to God had been claimed instead by the cold ground of St. Francis. By 1842, the church at St. Francis had grown colder than the season itself. Winters bit through the stone walls, and parishioners complained of shivering through Mass. Father Lucian answered with a calm smile and a request for donations. He said the furnace required repairs, that the faithful should give so the house of God could remain warm. They gave without hesitation. Coins were collected, lumber delivered, masons hired. To the eyes of the town it was maintenance, nothing more than bricks and coal. But beneath the church something else was being built, something that was not warmth but ritual. Later records tell of a hidden chamber, bricked into the foundation where the earth turned damp and heavy. Inside it stood a furnace not meant for comfort, but for torment. Its fire roared brighter than needed, its heat contained not by iron grates but by masks. Dozens of them, molded of blackened metal, fused directly onto the skulls of those who had worn them. Investigators years later found bone welded to steel, teeth clenched into iron grins, eye sockets fused into empty holes. The chamber smelled of ash long after the fire had gone out, the stones scarred by soot that no amount of scrubbing could erase. In his journals, Lucian had written of fire as a purifier, as a language older than prayer. He believed flesh must be marked by flame before the soul could ascend, that silence alone was not enough. The iron masks were his invention, cages for the head that allowed the body to remain upright while the heat consumed breath. The screams that must have echoed in that bricked chamber never reached the parish above. The thick stone walls turned agony into a low hum, blending with the steady crack of the fire. On Sundays, parishioners remembered smoke rising heavier than usual, dark plumes that clung to the rafters sinking into their clothes. They said nothing. They told themselves it was only the new fuel, only damp wood catching. But some details could not be hidden. The robes of the priests smelled of ash, not faintly but sharply, a stench that clung to fabric and hair. When families kissed the hands of their pastors after Mass, they noticed the heat in their skin as though the men had stood too close to the fire for too long. Children asked why the windows sweated even in cold weather, why a black dust settled in the corners of the nave. Parents hushed them, afraid of what answers might mean. The ledger for that year records the donations neatly, page after page of names and amounts. But in the margins in Lucien's hand there is another note. Ash does not speak, but it remembers. Nothing more. No mention of masks, no mention of the chamber, just that line as if it explained everything. When the furnace was finally sealed decades later, masons bricked the chamber shut without ceremony. They did not mark its place, yet those who worked there claimed they heard a faint ringing, as though iron struck by unseen hands. The priests of St. Francis had burned their choir into silence, leaving only smoke to rise as testimony. Above ground, the parish continued. Masses were said, hymns sung, children baptized. But beneath their feet lay a furnace that had roared too loud to be forgotten, and the earth pressed itself tight around the secret, holding it in silence, until the day the bricks would be broken again. By the early 1840s, the weight of whispers in St. Francis had grown too heavy to hide. Families had lost sons whose names no longer appeared on parish rolls. The smoke from the furnace still clung to clothing, and the line of unmarked graves stretched longer than anyone dared count aloud. For the first time, suspicions reached beyond the parish walls. Letters were written to the diocese, appeals made to civic authorities. The townspeople wanted inquiry, some scrap of justice, anything to confirm what their fear had already told them. Yet when the moment came, truth dissolved like smoke. Testimonies were gathered, but one by one they were dismissed. A mother who swore her boy had entered the rectory attic and never returned was told she was mistaken, that children wander. A woman who confessed she had been forced to kneel in salt until her knees split and bled was called hysterical. Her words scratched from the record. Her scars were not even examined. Men who described hearing cries beneath the church at night were written off as drunkards, their statements filed but never read. Paper trails that should have grown thick with evidence instead grew thin, pages vanishing into drawers that were later found empty. The few officials who did visit St. Francis claimed to find nothing but a quiet parish in need of repair. By then the walls had been repainted, the confessional rebuilt, the bells silenced. The furnace smoke no longer rose on Sundays. The surface was scrubbed clean. What lay beneath remained untouched, bricked and hidden. Father Lucian stood calm before every question, his smile soft, his hands folded. He admitted nothing, denied nothing, only repeated that the church was a house of obedience, and obedience did not require explanation. His composure itself became the defense. Rather than trial, rather than verdict, the solution was silence. Lucian was quietly transferred under the seal of the bishop's authority. Officially, it was called a promotion, a call to serve elsewhere. In truth, it was removal, a way to unburden St. Francis without admitting to scandal. The parish was left with new paint, muted bells, and a promise that life would go on. The townspeople accepted it outwardly, but inside, dread hardened into something worse than fear. Resignation. They had seen the system close around him, not to condemn, but to protect. The record books from that year show a gap where legal entries should have been. Lines left blank as if the scribes themselves refused to stain the page with words. Survivors carried their scars into silence, convinced that to speak again would only brand them mad. The woman with the ruined knees was committed to an asylum, her voice catalogued as delusion. The children who had endured Lucien's school of silence grew into adults who would not speak of it, who looked away when asked about their youth. The church in St. Francis endured, but its pews never filled the same way again. Even decades later, families hesitated to sit too near the front, as if fearing the altar itself had memory. The trial that never was left more than injustice. It left a wound that no verdict could close. The law did not fail by accident. It looked away on purpose, and in doing so, it let silence become the only judgment rendered. In the row of nameless stones in the cemetery, the earth kept its own record, each grave a verdict written without ink, each silence louder than any sentence the court might have spoken. In 1855, the state finally moved to address what could no longer be ignored. Too many rumors had circled across towns and parishes, too many priests had disappeared without trace, their deaths never entered, their burials left without witness. Whispers from St. Francis had reached further than the bishop's hand could suppress. And so a law was written. Every priest who died must be buried with his name recorded and his cause of death listed in official ledgers. No priest could vanish into soil without identity again. On paper, it was meant to bring light, a safeguard against silence. In practice, it only proved how deep silence could root itself. Historians would later trace this statute back to St. Francis, to the row of unmarked stones in the priest's section of the cemetery. Yet even after the law, those 13 graves remained untouched. No names were carved, no causes of death were written. They lay in their line, blank as the day they were cut, as if the law dared not touch them. The new rules applied to the future, not the past, and the past already had its teeth in the ground. Priests in other towns received proper markers, their inscriptions clear and dates precise. But in St. Francis, the row of anonymity stood like a wound no one stitched. Parishioners learned to avoid that side of the cemetery. They crossed themselves before turning onto other paths or hurried their steps as though the grass beneath might open. Families buried near the row complained of soil colder than the season, of flowers that withered too fast. And yet no official act forced change. The law was spoken, recorded, and applied elsewhere, but when it came to the 13, silence carried more authority than statute. Children, bolder in their ignorance, made games of it. They dared each other to run across the graves, to touch the earth and whisper the name of the priest they thought lay beneath. Some swore that when they did, their fingers tingled as if the ground itself pulsed. One boy returned home with blood on his palm, though no cut could be found. Parents scolded them, told them never to play in that row again, but the children laughed nervously, unable to resist the lure of forbidden soil. Behind their laughter, though, was fear, the kind that settles into a town until it becomes custom. The law of burial existed because the silence of St. Francis had frightened lawmakers. But within St. Francis itself, the silence remained stronger than law. The priests' names were never spoken aloud again. Their causes of death were never questioned. Even as the world outside began to demand accountability, the town lived as though the cemetery had its own rules, its own authority. The unmarked stones stood as proof that some graves could not be touched, that some silences were too dangerous to disturb. For outsiders, the law became progress, a safeguard against corruption. For St. Francis, it was a reminder of what could not be undone. 13 graves stood in defiance of it, 13 stones blank against the grass, and every person who passed by felt the weight of what the law refused to claim. The names might have been struck from records, but the earth had already taken them, and no decree could carve them back. By the turn of the century, the church at St. Francis had become little more than a shell. The parish had thinned, its pews hollow, and the rectory stood empty, shutters rattling against cracked glass. In 1901, the land was sold to a local family who intended to renovate the old residence into something livable. They thought they were purchasing only walls and timber, a building tired with age. But when workers climbed into the attic, dust rising like breath from a throat long closed, they uncovered something left behind, something that had been waiting. In the corner were trunks bound with iron straps, their locks rusted but intact. The men forced them open, expecting moth-eaten vestments or forgotten scripture. Instead, they found ledgers, dozens of them, thick and heavy, bound in leather that had darkened to near black. The handwriting inside was precise, neat Latin cursive that flowed without tremor. But the words did not speak of salvation. They spoke of procedure. Each page was filled with diagrams, the kind a physician might draw, only these were not for healing. They showed children bent into shapes, their arms lashed into crosses, their spines forced until bone cracked. Others depicted lungs tied to bellows, air pumped until the body swelled, ribs straining, silence finally breaking into collapse. Notes accompanied each illustration, cold instructions. Bind at joints. Ensure obedience is maintained. Do not release until hum ceases entirely. The further the workers turned, the worse it became. Charts listed ages 9, 11, 13, corresponding to entries marked suitable. Margins carried phrases that repeated like prayer. Obedience is proof. Silence is eternity. Between the diagrams, sentences cut sharper than scripture. The body must be unmade to free the soul. Each word revealed method, not madness, a logic carried out with patience dressed in faith. The men who read it dropped the books as if burned, but the words clung to their eyes. One ledger in particular drew fear more than the rest. Its final pages bore no diagrams, only a single phrase written again and again until the ink bled through. We are nameless to be eternal. The repetition was manic but disciplined, the script never faltering, as if the hand that wrote it was steady, determined, unbroken even in obsession. That phrase seemed to echo the cemetery row. The 13 stones left blank as if the very law of burial had been mocked. To be nameless was not punishment, it was victory, an eternity of silence that could never be undone by inscription. Word of the discovery spread, but official response was little different than it had been 70 years before. Authorities collected a handful of the ledgers, placed them in archives, and sealed the rest away. Historians wrote of them briefly, dismissing the details as exaggeration, the product of hysteria from an era that feared too much. The trunks themselves vanished into private hands, traded like cursed artifacts no one wished to keep but no one dared destroy. In St. Francis, the attic was bricked shut, the new owners refusing to live beneath what had been left there. Yet those who had seen the ledgers never forgot. Some said the diagrams returned in dreams, that they woke to the sensation of cords pulling their arms wide, of lungs straining against invisible bellows. Others swore that the phrase, "We are nameless to be eternal," whispered in their ears when the house grew still. The attic stood sealed, but the weight of its words seeped through the rafters, pressing on every room below. The cemetery row remained unchanged, 13 stones still blank against the grass. But now the silence felt explained, if not excused. The nameless graves were not an accident. They were deliberate, part of the same doctrine that filled those ledgers. It was never about hiding shame. It was about building eternity through absence. In that sense, the law of burial had failed before it was even written. The names had been stripped not by neglect but by intent, erased so thoroughly that stone itself seemed to obey. When the renovators abandoned the rectory, they left more than an empty building. They left behind proof that silence could be taught, could be engineered, could be worshipped until it became stronger than law or memory. The attic had been opened, and what it revealed was not only cruelty but conviction. A conviction that still echoed in the line of nameless graves, waiting for anyone brave enough to ask what it meant to make eternity out of silence. In 1920, when the Church of St. Francis was finally torn down, it was spoken of as progress. The stone walls were crumbling, the steeple leaning, and the parish long abandoned. Men with hammers and ropes reduced it to rubble, and townspeople gathered to watch the ruin fall, hoping the dust would also bury memory. But in the cemetery, nothing changed. The 13 graves were left untouched, their stones blank as ever, their silence heavier than the noise of demolition. The ground there seemed immune to progress. Even as new buildings rose, the row of nameless markers stood like a scar the earth refused to heal. Children who never saw Lucian or his priests grew up with the row as part of their folklore. They dared each other to run across the stones at night, to touch the earth and listen. Some claimed that when the wind shifted, they heard bells ringing faintly, though the church tower was gone. Others said the sound came from beneath the soil, a hollow toll that vibrated up through the grass. Parents dismissed these tales as childish fancy, but the older generation knew better. Survivors' descendants remembered scars that could not be explained, stories that had been whispered in kitchens late at night, of salt pressed into skin, of tongues split, of hymns that ended in silence. They carried the weight without evidence, wounds without trials, knowledge passed down in fragments too painful to speak whole. Even as time moved on, justice never came. No trials were reopened, no ledgers read aloud in court, no names restored to the blank stones. The state's law of burial remained, but it was powerless against the silence at St. Francis. Historians would later write that the parish was an oddity, an outlier, but the families who lived in its shadow felt something more enduring. They felt betrayal, the knowledge that their ancestors' suffering had been dismissed, hidden, left to rot beneath unmarked soil. The cemetery became a wound in the town's body, visible and ignored. Weddings were held, crops harvested, factories built. But whenever funerals passed through the gate, mourners turned their heads to avoid the priest's row. Even strangers noticed the gap, the 13 stones that bore no names while every other grave carried one. The blankness itself accused. It said there had been lives here, taken and erased, and that no authority dared carve them back. Some families tried to forget, but forgetting never lasted. A boy would dream of bells that rang without rope. A woman would hum without meaning to. The sound breaking into silence that made her weep. These echoes were the inheritance left by the nameless. They were not memorials of peace, but reminders of obedience forced through pain, scars carried into generations. By the time the rubble of the church was cleared, the town knew that the building could be erased, but its shadow could not. The legacy of the 13 priests was not faith, nor leadership, nor sacrifice. It was absence, silence, and the line of stones that stood against time. Nameless yet heavy with memory, they remain the truest monument to what happened there. A monument carved not in words, but in the refusal of words. The cemetery still waits, wound unhealed, soil unsettled, carrying a silence that outlives even stone. Evil at St. Francis was never loud. It did not come in storms of rage or in crimes done openly. It came in patience, in method, in repetition so ordinary it almost looked like devotion. It wore robes that carried the scent of incense, hands that blessed children, a smile that lingered just long enough to seem holy. It baptized infants, shared bread at tables, stood at gravesides offering comfort, and all the while, beneath that mask, it was recording, reshaping, and silencing lives. What makes the story so unbearable is not only what was done, but how it was done. There was no frenzy, no chaos, only calculation, ritual, and the steady certainty of a man who believed his cruelty was sacred. When we look back, we see the signs so clearly. The children who never returned from lessons, the mothers who stopped speaking, the graves that carried no names, the smoke that rose too thick from the furnace, the whispers that spread but never reached trial. Yet at the time, the people of St. Francis told themselves it was nothing, or told themselves it was better not to ask. They trusted robes and smiles more than their own fear. And in that silence, evil thrived. Silence was not only the tool Lucian used, it was the air that allowed him to breathe. This is why the graves matter. 13 stones left blank in defiance of law, left nameless even when the world around them demanded identity. They are not simply markers of death, but of what happens when obedience is stronger than truth. They stand as proof that entire lives can be erased not only by violence, but by the refusal to name, the refusal to remember. The blankness itself is the verdict. It says, these men were here, and yet they are not. They lived, they ruled, and they were buried without a trace of who they were. Evil here did not hide in shadows, it hid in prayer. It taught children that silence was purity. It convinced priests that obedience was higher than life. It whispered in the ears of parishioners that to question was to sin. And when the whispers finally grew loud enough to reach authorities, the response was not action but dismissal. Papers were lost. Testimonies were struck. Survivors were branded as hysterical, as insane. The system itself became another kind of silence, one that protected the guilty and buried the truth. The question that lingers is not just what happened then, but what it means now. If cruelty can hide in devotion, if it can wear smiles and robes and rituals, how would we recognize it today? Would we see it in institutions that ask for obedience before truth? Would we notice it in leaders who preach sacrifice but demand silence? Or would we, like the parishioners of St. Francis, convince ourselves that suspicion is dangerous, that trust is safer, that to ask questions is to break faith? The story of St. Francis is not only history, it is a warning. Evil does not need rage, it does not need to scream. It can hum patiently, it can bless a meal, it can hold a child's hand. It can wait, and in waiting it can bury names until only silence remains. The cemetery row still stands, 13 stones blank against the grass. Local children still whisper about bells that toll when the wind shifts, about soil that feels colder than the rest. Survivors are long gone, but their descendants carry memories of scars, of whispers, of silence pressed too deep to forget. There has never been justice, only the endurance of those stones. So the final question is left for us. What do you think? Could this happen again? If cruelty could hide so well in prayer, if silence itself could become a weapon, how would we see it now? And if we saw it, would we have the courage to speak, or would we let the silence pray louder than voices once more?